Miles Garrison had never been the kind of man who looked for mysteries where none seemed to exist. Yet his life had always been colored by a faint unease, as though the ground beneath him shifted just slightly more than it should. He was a craftsman by trade, restoring antique furniture in a quiet workshop, and had no real appetite for drama or secrecy. When his older brother, Nathan, passed away suddenly the previous spring, Miles found himself the reluctant inheritor of a modest farm on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town, a property they had not spoken about in years. The two men had grown apart, not because of any great falling out, but through the slow erosion of adulthood, where phone calls became rare and holidays were shared with different circles. Nathan had been a complicated figure, distant and strangely private, always hinting at work that he never fully explained, and when the will revealed that the farm and everything on it now belonged to Miles, the bequest felt more like a burden than a gift. Still, he packed his belongings, left his cramped apartment above the furniture shop, and drove west to take possession of the land, telling himself he would treat it as a temporary project before deciding whether to sell. The farmhouse itself, weathered and leaning slightly to one side, could still be coaxed into livability, and the fields that stretched out behind it held a certain rough charm, golden weeds bending under the wind. Yet the structure that dominated the property in Miles's mind was the barn, a hulking wooden building standing at the edge of a tree line, its red paint long since flaked into gray, the roof sagging in places, and its wide doors chained shut with a rusted lock. Nathan had mentioned the barn exactly once in a letter written years earlier. Leave it be. Nothing good inside Miles had laughed at the time, assuming his brother was being melodramatic, but when he arrived and saw the building in person, something about the way it crouched at the border of the forest made his laughter die away. He could not have explained it rationally, but the barn radiated a peculiar silence, as if it were not abandoned but watchful. Neighbors introduced themselves politely enough during the first week, though Miles quickly sensed they were careful not to linger. Most of their questions circled around whether he intended to stay long, whether he planned to farm the land or let it go wild, and none of them mentioned the barn directly, though he noticed their eyes flicker toward it when they thought he wasn't looking. One older man, a farmer named Jacob, paused as they spoke by the fence line and gestured vaguely in the barn's direction before stopping himself, shaking his head and saying instead, "Keep the place in order, son. Folks around here don't like loose ends." Miles filed the comment away, unsure whether it was a warning or just rural advice, and decided not to push. Life settled into a routine of small repairs, fixing shutters, mending a cracked water pipe, replacing the front steps. He spent his evenings in the workshop corner he had set up in the kitchen, restoring a set of 19th-century chairs he had brought from his old job, the familiar rhythm of sanding and oiling soothing his nerves. The barn remained closed, untouched, a shadow at the edge of his daily vision. Sometimes, late at night, he thought he heard faint noises from that direction, metal clinking, wood shifting, but when he opened the window to listen, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. He considered cutting the chain and looking inside, but Nathan's words echoed in his mind, vague but insistent. Nothing good inside. And so he let the barn stand in its silence, convinced that, in time, he would decide what to do with it. That conviction began to waver one cold October evening when, while returning from town, Miles slowed his truck at the entrance of the gravel driveway and saw a dark vehicle parked near the barn. Its lights were off, the windows tinted, and as he pulled closer, the driver's door opened and a man in coveralls stepped out. Miles stopped at a distance, uncertain whether to confront him or call out. The man did not try to break the lock or force entry. Instead, he simply stood there in the dark, facing the barn with his hands in his pockets, his posture oddly patient, as though he were waiting for something. After several minutes, he walked back to his vehicle, started the engine, and drove away without acknowledging Miles's presence. No license plate glinted in the headlights, no dust trail lingered in the air, and within seconds the truck was gone, leaving only the quiet bulk of the barn behind. For a long moment, Miles remained in his own truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened, unable to decide whether he had just witnessed something significant or merely unnerving. When he finally moved again, it was to drive up to the farmhouse, telling himself not to overthink it. Yet, as he passed the barn, he noticed the lock on the doors swaying slightly, as if touched by a hand only moments earlier. And though the wind was still, the sight made him feel as though someone, or something, had just been there and would be again. The morning after the strange encounter left Miles uneasy. Not because of what he had seen exactly, but because of the deliberate absence of explanation that clung to it. The sense that something had unfolded in his presence while he was not meant to understand it. He tried to go about his day as usual, repairing a cracked window frame, sweeping dust from the floorboards, but every time he glanced toward the edge of the property, the barn seemed to lean a little heavier in his vision, demanding acknowledgement. That night he barely slept, and when dawn came, he convinced himself that he was being foolish, that the world contained plenty of odd people and odder habits, and that perhaps the stranger had simply been lost, a hunter or surveyor who had mistaken the property for public land. Yet by mid-morning he noticed fresh tire marks pressed into the gravel near the barn, narrower than his own truck's tread, as if confirming that someone had indeed been there, circling, pausing, and then leaving without explanation. He crouched to examine the impressions, his fingers brushing the damp earth, and felt the hair rise on his arms. Later that week, as Miles sorted through the mail dropped into the metal box at the end of the driveway, he found an envelope unlike the rest. Heavier stock, no return address, his name scrawled in block letters across the front. Expecting perhaps a local flyer or an unpaid bill forwarded from his old apartment, he carried it inside and opened it over the kitchen counter. The letterhead inside was printed with a city emblem he did not recognize, and the tone of the typed words made his pulse quicken. It informed him, curtly, that his property had been the subject of an incident under investigation, and that he was required to attend a meeting at the county office to clarify matters of jurisdiction and liability. No details were provided beyond the date and time, which was set for the very next day. When he arrived at the county building, a squat structure with gray stone walls that seemed designed to repel curiosity, he was led not to a public counter, but to a private office on the second floor. A man in a pressed shirt and tie sat behind a desk, his expression so bland it verged on hostile, and gestured for Miles to sit. Without preamble, the man slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, of the barn's interior, captured from multiple angles. Miles felt his mouth go dry. The images showed the barn not as he knew it, dusty, neglected, chained shut, but clean, organized, lined with crates stacked with military precision, metal racks holding equipment he could not identify, wires trailing into corners, and in one frame, what looked unmistakably like a camera mounted high against the beams. Miles closed the folder, unable to process the dissonance. "This isn't my barn," he said, though the words sounded ridiculous even to himself. The man behind the desk only tilted his head. "It is," he replied, his voice flat. "Or rather, it was. Do you recall allowing anyone access? Any unusual visitors?" Miles shook his head, his confusion spilling into anger. "I never opened it. It's been locked since I arrived." "My brother didn't even use it." The official leaned back, folding his hands, and for a moment his eyes narrowed as though he were searching for cracks in Miles's story. Then he said, "We advise you not to involve yourself further. The site is under review." When Miles pressed for details, what the equipment was, why it had been there, why he had never been informed, the man ended the meeting abruptly, standing and signaling that the conversation was over. He drove home with the folder still vivid in his mind, the images etched behind his eyes like afterburn. When he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Jacob, the neighbor who had spoken to him earlier, leaning against the fence as though waiting. Jacob gave a polite nod but said nothing about the barn, only asked whether Miles needed help clearing brush before the frost came. Yet, when Miles mentioned the meeting at the county office, the older man's expression flickered, a muscle tightening near his jaw, and he quickly excused himself, muttering something about chores. That evening, Miles stood at his kitchen sink staring out at the silhouette of the barn against the darkening sky. His mind replayed the photographs over and over, trying to reconcile them with the structure he saw each day. Was it possible that the barn had been emptied between his visits? That someone had come and gone with such speed and efficiency that he had noticed nothing? But even that explanation did not account for the cleanliness, the order, the sterile sense of purpose visible in the photos. It was as though the barn he had inherited had existed in two parallel versions. One visible to him, the other hidden behind a curtain he had never been allowed to pull aside. The fire came 2 nights later. Miles woke to the sharp crack of wood splitting and the acrid scent of smoke. He rushed outside barefoot, heart hammering, and saw the barn engulfed in flames, the night lit orange against the trees. For a moment he was frozen by the scale of it, the heat so intense he could feel his skin prickle from 30 yards away. He shouted, though there was no one to hear, and fumbled for the hose, but the water pressure was pitiful, a thin arc that evaporated before it reached the blaze. By the time the fire trucks arrived, sirens wailing through the still air, the barn was collapsing inward, beams crashing in showers of sparks. The firefighters worked with professional calm, but Miles noticed that none of them approached too close, as though they already knew what was inside and wanted no part of it. After the flames were doused, leaving only a skeletal frame hissing with steam, one of the firemen approached Miles, his face smeared with soot. "Accident," he said briskly, though no one had asked the question yet. "Old wood, spontaneous combustion happens." His tone was dismissive, rehearsed, and when Miles opened his mouth to protest, the man turned away to confer with his crew. Later, a police officer filled out a perfunctory report, writing so quickly it seemed he was copying from a template. And when Miles tried to describe the stranger he had seen days earlier, the officer cut him off with a flat, "We'll make a note." Miles lay awake the rest of that night, the image of the burning barn seared into his mind. He felt less grief than bewilderment, an unnerving sense that he had been forced onto a stage he never agreed to step on, performing in a play where the script had already been written by others. By morning, the ash still smoldering at the property's edge, he realized something more chilling than the fire itself. The barn had been destroyed not to erase neglect, but to erase knowledge, and the only person left in possession of the fragments was him. For several days after the fire, Miles moved about the farmhouse in a daze, each room feeling smaller, the air heavy with the acrid memory of smoke that seemed to cling to his skin no matter how many showers he took. He tried to focus on ordinary tasks, hoping that repairing a chair or clearing weeds would return a sense of order, but every hammer strike or scrape of wood felt like a false note in a song he no longer knew how to play. The barn's blackened skeleton loomed at the edge of his property, a constant reminder that someone else had chosen for him what he was allowed to see and what must be taken away. Neighbors stopped passing by altogether. Even the casual waves from distant tractors vanished, replaced by silence that stretched across the fields like a boundary line. He felt not merely alone, but deliberately isolated, as though the entire community had been instructed to treat him as an exile. One afternoon, he decided to confront the county office again, unwilling to accept the fire marshal's curt conclusion. He drove into town and waited nearly an hour in a fluorescent-lit hallway before being shown to a side office where a different official received him, this one younger, his smile practiced but fragile. Miles explained what had happened, insisted that the photographs of the barn's interior had been real, and demanded to know whether the fire was being investigated as arson. The official listened politely, nodded in all the right places, and at the end of Miles' account simply said, "We appreciate your cooperation," as though the entire conversation had been a scripted performance designed to pacify him. When Miles pressed, the man leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice, almost conspiratorial. "You don't want to push too hard. These matters, they resolve themselves." There was no threat in the words, yet Miles felt the weight of something darker behind them, a warning disguised as advice. The following morning, he found his mailbox open and empty, though he had not collected the mail the day before. At first he assumed kids had tampered with it, but when he checked again in the evening, he discovered a single folded sheet of paper tucked inside. There was no envelope, no salutation, only a sentence typed in black ink. "Your brother understood the rules. You should too." He stood on the gravel road for a long time, the note trembling in his hands, the fields around him whispering in the wind. There was no signature, no indication of who had placed it there, but the message was clear. His silence was expected. Sleep became fractured, a series of shallow dozes interrupted by the faint suspicion of movement outside his windows. Once, at 2 a.m, he thought he heard footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, but when he opened the door with a flashlight in hand, the night was empty except for the smell of damp earth. Another time, while taking the trash to the edge of the property, he noticed a coin glinting in the dirt. When he picked it up, he saw that it was a tarnished quarter dated from the early 90s. Its surface rubbed smooth in places as if handled obsessively. He could not explain why the object unsettled him so deeply, only that it felt less like a random drop and more like a token deliberately left for him to find, a sign that someone was marking their presence without revealing themselves. Desperate for clarity, Miles decided to search through the remnants of the barn despite the warnings and the danger implied. The charred beams still steamed faintly in the cool morning air as he climbed over the blackened rubble, his boots crunching through layers of ash. The stench was overwhelming, but he forced himself onward, prying loose planks and overturning fragments of collapsed roof. Near the foundation, he found a section where the fire had burned less completely, and beneath the brittle boards his hand struck something metallic. After half an hour of digging, he uncovered a small box sealed in rusted hinges. With effort, he pried it open to reveal not farm tools or forgotten keepsakes, but a stack of water-damaged papers, fragments of ledgers written in a language he could not read, and, most disturbingly, a laminated access card with a magnetic strip. The kind used to open secure doors in government buildings. The discovery left him shaken, though it was not merely the contents of the box that unsettled him, but the realization that the fire had not erased everything, that someone had meant to destroy traces but had missed this buried remnant. He carried the box back to the house and laid its contents across the dining table, staring at them until his vision blurred. The card bore no name, only a sequence of numbers, and when he ran his fingers across the raised plastic, he felt a shiver of recognition he could not place. He tried searching the numbers online, but every query led nowhere, the screen flickering as though resisting the intrusion. He thought of taking the items to the police, but the memory of the county official's warning replayed in his mind, the words tightening around him like invisible hands. That night, as rain lashed against the windows, he sat in the dark with the box at his feet, convinced that if he left it in plain sight, something irreversible would happen. At midnight, he wrapped the items in cloth and hid them beneath the floorboards in the upstairs bedroom, hammering the planks back into place with trembling hands. When he returned to the kitchen, soaked in sweat despite the cold, he found the front door ajar. He could have sworn he had locked it, yet the latch hung loose, swaying slightly with the draft. Nothing inside seemed disturbed, no drawers opened, no objects stolen. But the simple fact that someone had entered without leaving a trace was more terrifying than any obvious burglary. By the end of the week, the silence of the neighbors deepened into hostility. At the general store, the cashier who had once greeted him warmly now pretended not to see him, passing his change across the counter without meeting his eyes. A pair of men leaning near the entrance stopped talking as he approached, their expressions flat, their gaze following him out into the parking lot. He felt hunted not through violence but through erasure, his existence being rewritten in real time, his place in the community deleted as though he were a character in a story someone else had decided should vanish. The first escalation was not a single dramatic event, but the accumulation of these intrusions, each small enough to dismiss individually yet together, forming a suffocating pressure. The barn was gone, its secrets supposedly erased, yet Miles understood now that the fire had not ended anything. It had merely stripped away the illusions, leaving him exposed. Whatever his brother had been involved in, whatever purpose the barn had served, that history was now pressing against him with cold, invisible hands, and he realized with dread certainty that he was not meant to uncover the truth, but to carry it. Wait in silence. The choice was no longer whether he would become involved, but how long he could resist being consumed by it. The decision to search deeper came less from courage than from exhaustion, for Miles realized that waiting in fear had become worse than the unknown itself. The box he had hidden beneath the floorboards gnawed at his thoughts, demanding to be opened again, but he resisted, convinced that the simple act of examining it might bring another intrusion. Instead, he turned to the farmhouse itself, combing through the upstairs office where his brother had once worked. Nathan had never been meticulous, yet Miles discovered that the drawers had been stripped nearly bare, the cabinets holding only scraps of paper that meant nothing. At first, he thought the room had simply been cleaned out after the funeral, but as he sifted through the shelves, he noticed faint rectangular outlines in the dust where folders had once rested, taken recently and deliberately. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Others had been inside before him, removing evidence, curating what he was allowed to find. Still, there were gaps in their work because in the back of a drawer warped by moisture, Miles found a thin packet of correspondence bound by a brittle rubber band. The letters were mostly receipts for repairs, shipments, and purchases that made little sense, but tucked among them was an envelope bearing a return address from a logistics company in Chicago. The envelope was empty, yet its flap contained a faint indentation as though something had once been pressed against it. Curious, Miles held it under lamplight and saw the impression of a series of numbers and dates, perhaps left by carbon paper. He jotted them down, though he had no idea what they represented, and returned the packet to its hiding place. That night, he lay awake with the numbers echoing in his mind, meaningless yet urgent, as if they were coordinates in a map only he did not possess. The following day, compelled by an unease he could not explain, Miles drove to the county recorder's office to obtain property records, thinking perhaps there would be some mention of the barn's supposed jurisdiction. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, entered his information into her computer, frowned, and printed a stack of papers. As she handed them across the counter, she whispered without looking at him, "This isn't a place to ask questions. Go home." Miles carried the documents to his truck and leafed through them. To his shock, the deed listed not only his brother's name, but a co-owner he had never heard of, a corporation with an address that did not exist. Furthermore, the barn itself was marked as a restricted structure, under a category he did not recognize, though no explanation was provided. The more he read, the more the pages seemed to contradict one another, as if written in layers by competing hands. That evening, determined to make sense of it all, Miles returned to the burned foundation of the barn. Kneeling in the ash, he pressed his palms against the cold concrete and felt for irregularities. To his surprise, the outline of a hatch revealed itself beneath a sheet of warped metal. With great effort, he pried it loose, coughing as the smell of charred wood rose around him. Beneath the hatch lay a shallow cavity that had been shielded from the fire. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several items: a thick ledger bound in leather, a series of Polaroid photographs, and a compact hard drive no larger than his hand. His first instinct was to recoil, to bury the items again, but curiosity overcame fear. Back inside the farmhouse, he spread the materials across the dining table. The ledger contained lists of names paired with dates and coded notations, none of which he recognized, though some were written in his brother's handwriting. The Polaroids were more unsettling. Images of vehicles parked in remote lots, men in suits standing outside nondescript warehouses, even a close-up of a street sign that belonged not to their town, but to one in another state entirely. The hard drive, when connected to his computer, refused to open without a password. Miles sat for hours staring at the blinking cursor of the prompt, feeling the weight of secrets pressing down on him. The breakthrough came by accident. As he handled the Polaroids, he noticed that one photo, depicting a van parked near a chain-link fence, had faint writing scrawled along its margin. CEX4. On impulse, he typed the characters into the password field of the hard drive, and, to his shock, the device unlocked. Inside were folders filled with encrypted files, but one opened easily, revealing a collection of surveillance logs. The reports were meticulous, describing meetings between unnamed individuals, transfers of crates, and coded references to transactions. Though the names were redacted, the dates matched the numbers he had found earlier pressed into the envelope. He realized with horror that his brother had not simply stored personal notes in the barn. The structure had been used as an operational hub, perhaps even as part of a larger investigation. As Miles scrolled through the files, he felt a strange mix of betrayal and grief. Nathan had never confided in him, never asked for help, and now the silence seemed deliberate, protective perhaps, but also cruel. He wondered whether his brother had known the danger he was leaving behind, whether he had expected Miles to discover these fragments or whether he had hoped the fire would consume everything. The ambiguity twisted inside him like a blade. That night, as rain drummed against the roof, Miles sat with the ledger and the photographs spread around him. The farmhouse felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing close, the shadows lengthening with each passing hour. He thought of the note left in his mailbox, the warning that his brother had understood the rules, and he realized that he stood at a threshold. He could destroy the evidence, burn it himself, and erase the last traces of Nathan's secret life, or he could push forward, knowing that each step would tighten the noose of unseen forces around him. The midpoint of his journey arrived not with clarity but with the sickening recognition that he was already entangled. Whether he chose silence or pursuit, the weight of the barn's hidden history was now his to carry. And as he glanced out the window into the dark fields beyond, he thought he saw a faint light flicker at the tree line, a reminder that others were watching, waiting to see what choice he would make. The days that followed felt like a tightening vice, each hour pressing Miles further into a reality that no longer resembled the quiet life he had once imagined. He had crossed a line the moment he opened the hard drive, and though no one had appeared at his door demanding it back, the silence itself felt like a calculated response, as though those who monitored him were content to let him sweat beneath the weight of what he now knew. Sleep came only in fragments, and even when exhaustion finally dragged him under, he woke with the sense that he was not alone in the room. Once, in the early hours before dawn, he thought he heard a car idling outside his farmhouse, but when he crept to the window, all he saw was the glint of moisture on the gravel and the suggestion of tire tracks that had not been there the evening before. Desperation gnawed at him, pushing him to act despite his better judgment. He decided to confront the records directly, to verify whether the names in the ledger had any grounding in reality. Carefully copying a handful of entries, he drove into the nearest city, a place large enough that he might ask questions without drawing too much suspicion. At a public library, hunched over a computer, he searched through obituaries, property transfers, and old newspaper clippings. To his dismay, the names appeared in scattered reports. One belonged to a local businessman found dead under circumstances labeled undetermined. Another to a truck driver who had vanished on a route between states. A third to a man arrested for arms trafficking but released without charge. The connections were thin, yet undeniable, and the realization struck him with cold clarity. Nathan's ledger was not some idle collection of notes but a record of movements tied to crimes that had been sanitized from public view. That evening, when Miles returned to the farmhouse, he found the front gate left wide open. He was certain he had closed it in the morning, yet the chain hung loose as if deliberately displayed. Inside, the house seemed untouched until he noticed the dining table where he had left the ledger and photographs. The items were still there, arranged exactly as he remembered, but the positions were off by inches, as though someone had lifted each piece, examined it, and then replaced it with clinical precision. On the corner of the table lay a single cigarette butt, crushed flat, though Miles had never smoked a day in his life. He felt an almost physical wave of dread, understanding that whoever had entered had not come to steal or threaten, but to remind him of their reach, to demonstrate how completely his privacy had already been eroded. The following night brought no reprieve. He was roused from uneasy half-sleep by the sharp cry of an animal outside. Rushing to the porch, he saw his neighbor Jacob's dog limping across the field, its side streaked with blood. Before Miles could react, the animal staggered into the shadows and disappeared. Moments later, he noticed a wooden post driven into the ground near the remains of the barn. Hanging from it was a scrap of cloth, singed at the edges, and on its surface were the faint outlines of numbers scrawled in marker. Miles recognized them instantly. They were the same coordinates he had seen impressed in the empty envelope weeks earlier. Whoever had left the message wanted him to follow, though whether as a test, a trap, or an invitation, he could not tell. He wrestled with the choice for hours, pacing the creaking floorboards of the farmhouse, but in the end, curiosity won. At dawn, he packed the ledger and photographs into a satchel and drove toward the indicated location, a half-abandoned industrial district on the far edge of town. The coordinates led him to a warehouse with boarded windows and rusted doors. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, and shafts of light cut through gaps in the roof. In the center of the floor stood a row of folding chairs arranged as though a meeting had taken place recently, and on one chair rested a manila folder. Miles approached with caution, his heart hammering, and opened it to find copies of surveillance photographs nearly identical to the Polaroids from his brother's collection. Yet these were newer, dated only weeks earlier, and among the figures captured in the grainy images was a face Miles recognized with a jolt. It was the same county official who had warned him that these matters resolve themselves. Before he could process the discovery, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Miles stuffed the folder into his satchel and ducked behind a stack of crates, holding his breath. Two men entered, dressed not in uniforms but in plain work clothes, their movements purposeful, their conversation muted. One of them carried a heavy flashlight sweeping its beam across the floor. The light passed inches from where Miles crouched, but neither man seemed to notice him. They collected the folding chairs in silence, stacked them neatly, and then left through the side door without once looking back. The message was unmistakable. They had allowed him to see just enough, and his presence there had been anticipated. By the time he returned to the farmhouse, dusk had settled, and the weight of inevitability pressed hard against his chest. The documents he carried were no longer evidence, but a fuse, and every moment he remained in possession of them brought him closer to an explosion he could not avoid. He realized then that the escalation was not merely external. It had burrowed inside him, transforming him from a cautious man into a participant, and the very act of surviving required him to accept that there would be no safe return to the life he once knew. The barn's secrets had not died in the fire. They had multiplied, reaching out in shadows and whispers, binding him tighter to a story that had already claimed his brother. And now, as he stood in the farmhouse staring at the darkened fields, he understood that the next move would not be his to make, but theirs, and when it came, it would arrive with a force that left no room for hesitation. The night of the breaking point arrived with the subtlety of a storm creeping in behind a wall of silence, and though Miles could not have said precisely when the shift occurred, he felt it in the heaviness of the air, the way the crickets stilled, Outside his windows and the lights of distant farmhouses seemed to dim. He had been sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open before him, staring at the columns of names and numbers that no longer felt abstract, but instead throbbed with an immediacy he could not escape. The satchel containing the Polaroids and the warehouse folder leaned against the chair leg, and each time he considered burning them, something in him recoiled, a stubborn conviction that if Nathan had preserved them, then they had to be carried forward, whatever the cost. He knew, however, that simply holding the materials had already branded him, that the silence which had once felt like distance was now an active pressure surrounding him, pushing him toward confrontation. At some point after midnight, the farmhouse shuddered with a low noise. Not quite a knock, not quite an impact, but a vibration that rolled through the floorboards. Miles rose and stepped into the hallway, his ears straining, and then the lights cut out, plunging the house into darkness. For a moment, he thought it was a power failure, but when he looked out the front window, he saw that the neighboring fields still glowed faintly with electricity. The outage was his alone. A sweep of headlights moved slowly along the road, pausing at the gate, then sliding past without entering, a deliberate reminder that he was being observed. He felt his pulse rise in his throat, and for the first time in weeks he abandoned caution, pulling the satchel to his chest and slipping out the back door into the night. The fields were damp with dew, and the grass clung to his jeans as he pushed toward the tree line. He had no destination in mind, only the primal urge to escape the suffocating weight of the house, but as he reached the charred skeleton of the barn, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was the county official, his silhouette unmistakable even in the dim light, though his suit jacket hung open now and his face carried none of the professional blandness Miles remembered. Instead, his expression was intent, focused as he said quietly, "You've seen enough." Handed over, Miles gripped the satchel tighter, shaking his head before he even realized what he was doing. The man sighed, as if the refusal had been expected, and gestured. From the tree line emerged two others, the same plain-clothed men from the warehouse, their movements calm, rehearsed. They did not rush him. They simply closed the circle, confident that resistance would collapse under inevitability. But Miles surprised even himself. Rather than retreat, he demanded to know what had happened to Nathan, whether his brother had died of natural causes or had been silenced like one of the names in the ledger. The question seemed to unsettle the official more than defiance itself, and for the first time his voice broke from its smooth cadence. He understood the rules, he said, echoing the message that had once been left in Miles's mailbox, and in that repetition lay an admission more damning than any direct confession. Something inside Miles hardened then, a recognition that silence would not save him, and he swung the satchel over his shoulder and bolted toward the burned shell of the barn. The men gave chase, but the ruins offered strange protection. The beams, unstable and jagged, forced them to slow, while Miles scrambled over the debris with a desperation that lent him strength. In the heart of the wreckage, he pulled free one of the metal plates that had covered the hidden cavity weeks earlier and used it as a barrier, slamming it into the path of the first pursuer. The man stumbled, cursing, and in that instant Miles turned and climbed through a gap in the collapsed roof, emerging into the night on the far side. Behind him, voices shouted, but no gunfire followed, only the measured tread of men who believed time itself was on their side. Miles fled across the field, lungs burning, until he reached the gravel road where his truck waited. He knew he had only moments, and instead of driving home, he turned toward the highway, the satchel still pressed against him like a lifeline. In the distance, another set of headlights appeared, blocking the road ahead. But rather than braking, he veered onto a dirt track that cut through the woods, the suspension jolting violently as branches scraped the sides. He drove without direction, guided only by the conviction that he had to keep moving, to force unpredictability into a game that had been orchestrated against him from the start. By dawn, exhausted and trembling, he pulled off into an abandoned rest stop and collapsed against the steering wheel. The satchel remained beside him, untouched, yet its presence had transformed from burden to weapon. the only leverage he possessed against forces too vast to comprehend. He understood then that the climax was not escape but choice. He could surrender the materials and disappear into silence like his brother, or he could push forward, carrying evidence that others would kill to bury. Neither path promised survival, but in that moment, with the sun breaking over the horizon and the fields stretching endless beyond, Miles realized that the fire which had consumed the barn had not erased the truth. It had only revealed how dangerous truth could be. The days that followed blurred together, measured not in hours but in the weight of silence that surrounded Miles as he drove farther from the town, taking back roads that twisted across the state until even he no longer knew where he was heading. The farmhouse, the barn, the neighbors who had turned their eyes away, those things receded into memory, yet he carried them all with him, not as attachments but as warnings, reminders that once the machinery of secrecy reached into a life, it never let go. He stopped at motels under false names, paying in cash, sleeping lightly with the satchel under his arm. The documents, the photographs, the hard drive, they had become his inheritance, not the land or the buildings, but the evidence of a world he had never chosen and yet could never escape. Sometimes he considered destroying it all, scattering the ashes into some anonymous river, but each time he hesitated, convinced that to erase the proof would be to erase Nathan entirely, to let his brother vanish into the same silence that had claimed him. It was in one of those motels, the wallpaper peeling and the neon light flickering through the blinds, that Miles opened the ledger one last time. He traced his finger along the lines of his brother's handwriting, the names and numbers that had once seemed meaningless now forming a pattern too intricate to ignore. He realized that whatever network Nathan had been tangled in, it had extended beyond one barn, beyond one small town, touching places Miles had never been. He also understood, with a clarity that chilled him, that he would never be allowed to simply walk away. The barn had burned, but the story remained alive in him, and as long as he drew breath, others would be waiting to see what he did next. When he left the motel at dawn, he carried no illusions of victory. The satchel was still with him, heavy against his shoulder, but it no longer felt like a burden alone. It was a signal, a thread that tied him to a brother he had never truly known, and to a truth that refused to stay buried. He did not know if he would end up hunted, silenced, or forgotten, but as he stepped onto the road with the sun rising low and pale across the horizon, he accepted that he had crossed into a life shaped not by choice, but by inheritance. The fire had consumed the barn, yet in its ashes he had found something far more enduring, the certainty that some secrets do not die when buildings fall, they live on in the people left behind to carry them. And Miles, whether he wished it or not, was one of them now.